I wanted to ask you, Garrett, how are you coping in the world we live in now, where apparently last night we had the greatest interview that was ever conducted? Like, how are you coping today after that?
I didn't watch anything this week. I have nothing in the TV films category, and I was actually going to be like, should I just bring this up?
I haven't seen it, so I was recording at the time, but I saw a couple of screen grabs of a man in his 70s who is in what I could only describe as a WrestleMania tan type of tan. Um, but yeah, I read some of the snippets and I saw some of the people declaring this was like the greatest interview ever, or just like such a look in an insight into the man that is Vince McMahon and really bringing out his humane side. And I was like, what? Like, all I heard is, or all I read is that he lifts weights at 1:30 in the morning, which I knew about 20 years ago. Like, what the fuck is this?
It's so strange to see people like fawn over this. Like, it was just a really boring interview. It was really boring. You can like poke holes in Pat McAfee asking a question about Saudi Arabia that is essentially, so how much did you change the world, Vince? Instead of being like, hey, maybe to get into the bed with the Saudi regime is bad. How do you feel about that? Which would be any reasonable journalistic question. Even if you want to softball it, it's like, you'd be like, well, tell me about the relationship with Saudi Arabia. You would not frame the question as, so how much have you seen Saudi Arabia change in your time working with them? That's just a load of bullshit. Like, you can poke all those kind of holes and him freaking out when he was offered the match at WrestleMania and all that shite, and it's an employee fawning over his boss. Even taking all that out of it, it was just a really boring interview. Like, just for a 90-minute sit down with the most important person in the history of wrestling, probably. I don't think that's an overstatement to say Vince McMahon is the most important person in the history of professional wrestling. So you're sitting there 90 minutes with this dude who has put WCW out of business. He put the territories out of business. He's run a wrestling company for 40 years. There is so much you can talk to him about. And all you do get is, wow, you lift weights at 1 a.m. and you don't like people praising you for things. Okay.
Yeah,
He got nothing out of the man, and I have no idea how. I do. It's the co-opted journalists and a bunch of
yeah.
bullshit nonsense people being like, "Wow, that's the most insightful interview I've ever seen." It's like, literally, go watch the interview he did with Stone Cold. It's a much better interview.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really surprised because, I mean, to call this a journalistic interview would to be calling Pat McAfee a journalist, which he is not. And as you pointed out, he is employed. Like, Vince McMahon does employ him. So there was nothing about the interview that I've read that surprises me. Like, the biggest thing that surprised me is like people fawning over themselves. Like, this was some great revolutionary or relative, like, just, some sort of like real insight into Vince McMahon. And I'm not seeing it, but yeah, wrestling media as a whole. I was listening to like the first 20-30 minutes of the Voice of Wrestling flagship this week, and Lanza went on one of his more spectacular rants he's done in a while about it, so that's worth checking out at some point.
It's
Yeah.
maddening. It drives me crazy. Like, I had low expectations for this interview. I thought there would be like softballs about the roster cuts and tell me about that, which there kind of was. And Vince was like, "Oh, we analyze talent based on how the fans feel about them," and that was his like quote unquote hardball question. But like, at the very least, Vince is, again, one of the most important people in the history of professional wrestling. He's weird. He's a weird human being. And he's very charismatic. So the last thing I expected the interview to be was boring. At least I thought, like, you'll get some weird Vinceisms. He'll tell some decent stories. Even if you learn nothing about him, even if it's basically like state media, you'll still maybe at least get a reasonable softball interview. It didn't even hit that standard for me. It wasn't even like it's Vince telling stories and making shit up in his Vince way, which would be at least somewhat amusing. And there is a little bit of that in the back half of the interview. Like, the first half of the interview is dreadful. It's like truly dreadful. It's one of those terrible Forbes, oh, tell me about how much you're a success. Like, one of the Pat McAfee questions, it's like, have you always been this creative?
For fuck's sake.
What are you supposed to learn with a question like that?
Yeah.
Like, ask him about his relationship with Ted Turner. Ask him about his approach to competition in the wrestling landscape. Ask him about his creative decision. You don't have to be like, oh, how did you fuck up with Keith Lee? That's not a question Pat McAfee is ever going to ask. But you can ask questions that, like, get an insight into his creative approach without being like too confrontational, and you might get some interesting answers from the man, especially because he does so few interviews these days. As mentioned, this is the first time he's done one since that Steve Austin interview, and again, the Steve Austin interview is a way better interview because Steve Austin both knows the man well enough to challenge him a little and is willing to actually ask reasonable questions that's not just, wow, how creative are you? So if you want an actually somewhat decent kind of softball interview with Vince McMahon, go watch the Austin interview he did for the Austin show on the network. It's way better than this Pat McAfee puff piece. It's just, the people like, oh, this is a great, that you really humanized Vince McMahon. It's like, what did you watch?